Hello, Minnesota Realtors, and welcome to the Minnesota Realtors 2022 forms changes. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of the forms changes that were made by our forms committee that will be effective August 1 of 2022. Starting with the residential forms, I just wanted to start with the purchase agreements. We made a couple of changes in our purchase agreements. I want to talk first about the financing contingency section of the purchase agreement. We made a couple changes there, two main changes. First and foremost, on the top section of that mortgage financing contingency section, where we talked about approval of a grant, bond program, or other loan assistance program, we eliminated that language. We had many of our members write in to express concern about possible misunderstandings pertaining to a buyer's ability to complete a transaction if they're using some of those programs and financing tools, placing those buyers at sort of a disadvantage in the offer process. And so for that reason, the Forms Committee decided to eliminate that language from our purchase agreement. Any concerns about the possibility that the seller had to have contributions for those particular programs, those can be addressed in the seller's contributions to closing costs section. So again, another reason that there was a decision by the committee to eliminate that language. The second major change in that financing contingency section pertains to the contingencies. You have two contingency options in your purchase agreement, and we made some modifications to the second contingency option pertaining to written statements. Specifically, as you know, currently in our language states that if a buyer is obligated to get a written statement from their lender or mortgage originator and provide that to the seller within the time period that's specified in the purchase agreement. And if they failed to do that, the seller had the right to cancel the purchase agreement if they didn't provide their written statement by that date. And if they canceled it, our current language states that the earnest money would be refunded to the buyer. The same thing happens if the buyer didn't provide the written statement and you got all the way to the closing date and the seller hadn't canceled, but the buyer never provided the written statement. We had an automatic cancellation in our purchase agreement, terminating the purchase agreement and refunding the earnest money to the buyer. Well, of course, the buyer is to be acting in good faith in order to get that written statement. And so the Forms Committee, in trying to address the concern that buyers aren't using good faith to get the written statement, we have an option there now. One of the changes will be effective August 1. You'll have a checkbox option where the earnest money can either be retained by the seller, or you can check that it's going to be refunded to the buyer in those two sections under the written statement section where the buyer doesn't provide the written statement and the seller has the right to cancel, or it automatically cancels if we get to the closing date. This is a very important change and one that you'll want to take note of because, again, buyer is supposed to be acting in good faith to go get that written statement from their lender. And if we do check that the earnest money will be retained by the seller, if the buyer does not get that written statement from their lender timely and gets it to the seller in a timely fashion prior to that date you've specified, and we've checked that it's going to be retained by the seller, obviously the buyer will be losing their earnest money in that regard. So it's going to be a very important change to take note of. The other change we made in the purchase agreement pertains to the special notices section of the purchase agreement. In that section, we added some language pertaining to discriminatory restrictive covenants. Specifically, we're just trying to inform consumers that discriminatory restrictive covenants are illegal and unenforceable. And it also explains that property owners can remove such restrictive covenants from their title in the county where the property is located. And those were all the changes we had to our purchase agreements. All right, turning our attention now to our addenda to the purchase agreement. We only modified two addenda to our purchase agreements. The first one is our buyer's move-in agreement. And on that particular addenda, there was only one change, and that pertained to the insurance section. We had some questions about whether or not buyers were even able to obtain insurance, liability insurance of that $300,000 amount that named the seller as additional insureds. So for that reason, we modified the language, and now it simply states that the buyer shall purchase and maintain liability insurance effective on the possession date, and it requires the buyer to provide the seller with an insurance binder. Of course, the buyer is still going to be responsible for any personal property insurance. The second addenda that we modified was the addendum to purchase agreement subsurface sewage treatment system and well water inspection contingency. The only change to this form is actually in the title, where we added the word water after well. And the reason we did that, of course, is to make it clear that we are just testing the water in this particular contingency to make sure that it is potable. There's no specific inspection of the mechanics of the well itself. We also added a new form, addendum to purchase agreement, additional signatures. This, of course, was created so that you could have additional signatures added to the purchase agreement in those scenarios where you have multiple property owners or multiple buyers. Oftentimes in estate sales, there might be multiple owners that need to sign. And so for that reason, we created an additional addendum for additional signatures. And those are all the changes we have for our addenda. Okay, on our buyer representation and facilitator services agreement, we made a couple of changes there as well. And that pertains to the shall or shall not question as to whether or not the compensation that the broker will be receiving from a seller or a seller's broker shall or shall not reduce the obligation of the buyer to compensate the buyer's broker. Now, that is language we had in our buyer representation contracts before, and if you recall, last year we modified that, and then we heard from many of you that we wanted to make it crystal clear in the buyer representation contract that the buyer shall or shall not have that compensation reduced. When we did have that information in the compensation disclosure to buyer form, although it was, people felt it was a little confusing in that regard. So we added that language back into our buyer representation and facilitator services agreement. We also clarified some language in our buyer rep contracts, very simple in that these contracts only pertain to property that you are trying to locate in the state of Minnesota. So very simple and straightforward clarification there. We also added another new form. It's an addendum or amendment to any of our representation contracts or our facilitator services agreements, and that is the interpreter appointment form. This is a new form to assist the client in appointing an interpreter and informing the broker that they are authorized to speak with their appointed interpreter. That could be a different language, that could be sign language, whatever that interpreter is needed for. And this authorizes the broker to be able to speak and provide confidential information through this interpreter for their client. I think it'll be a very useful form for any of your clients that would need to utilize an interpreter. And those are the only changes we have for our representation contracts. All right, turning our attention to our disclosure statements, specifically our seller's property disclosure statement. We made a couple of changes there that I want to tell you about. First of all, in the general information section, we modified that section pertaining to homeowners associations. We do currently have a question in there about homeowners associations, but we wanted to bring that out into its own line and also add whether or not it has any shared amenities. So you'll see a new line in there posing the question whether or not the property is part of a homeowners association or has shared amenities. The reason we did this is because there was concern, of course, about any properties where the property is part of a homeowners association and it may or may not be subject to Minnesota Statutes 515B. And so we wanted to highlight this question so that a buyer can know up front, we can start asking further questions or doing further investigation as to whether or not that property is or is not subject to 515B. And if it's not, we wouldn't be utilizing that condominium cooperative addendum in our purchase agreement because it wouldn't be subject to all of those disclosure provisions and other things. So very important question from a seller to understand and know whether or not this property might be part of a homeowners association, even though it wouldn't be applicable to 515B. Additionally, in the insurance claims section, you'll notice we modified this section a little bit pertaining to the question of whether or not the seller has an insurance claim related to the property. Previously, we asked whether it was a homeowner's insurance claim, but we eliminated the reference to homeowner's insurance and we're just asking if it's an insurance claim. That is for an example where if for example, a car went off the road and ran into the real property and damaged the real property, it might be the car insurance that covers that claim rather than the homeowner's insurance. So in that regard, we really just want to know, was there damage to the property? Was there an insurance claim? And in addition to that, we eliminated any reference to receipt of the compensation when requiring if the items were repaired. So in other words, instead of asking if the homeowner's insurance or any other insurance, we were compensated by the insurance company, we're just simply asking the seller, were those items repaired if there was an insurance claim? Additionally, in the appliances section, we modified the term invisible fence. We changed that to read in-ground pet containment system. The reason we did that was to be consistent with the language we have in the personal property section on the first page of our purchase agreement. And those are all the changes we made to the seller's property disclosure statement. We did make one minor change to the well disclosure statement. That was just really a correction. We had the wrong line reference number there. So for those of you who saw that, we have that corrected now. And that's all for our disclosure statements. All right, now that I've finished talking to you about all of our residential forms changes, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we did on the commercial side. Just a few changes there in our commercial purchase agreement and purchase agreement land non-residential. We made one change, and that was very similar to what we did on the residential side. We added language pertaining to those discriminatory restrictive covenants, where we added language in the notices section. Again, just informing consumers that discriminatory restrictive covenants are illegal and unenforceable, and they can get those removed from the title. We also made a change to the addendum to commercial purchase agreement counteroffer. This was actually a change that we had clarified on the residential side last year. We wanted to add it in the commercial side this year. It was just clarifying that the counteroffer addendum is valid upon signature and delivery of the purchase agreement. So remember, the counteroffer addendum is literally an addendum to the purchase agreement. We need all of the other terms of the purchase agreement to make it a complete offer. And so we need a copy of that purchase agreement along with the counteroffer addendum signed and delivered to the other party in order for us to have that offer. Also on our commercial buyer and tenant representation contracts, we added back the same language where clarification about whether or not if the buyer's broker were to obtain compensation from the seller or the listing broker, then it shall or shall not reduce any obligation of the buyer to pay that compensation to the buyer's broker. So we added that language back in there as well. And those are all the changes we have for 2022.